Today's sermon may stir up some big feelings, and I want you to know you're not alone. We have several of our lay pastoral care associates here. Can you wave your arms or something? There's a couple of you. Joy's up here, thank you. Yep. I asked Carolina, one of our therapists in the congregation, and I saw Melanie, there you go, yep, to be here today. Not that they're here to give you free therapy, but they can refer you to things. I also took one of our therapy referral lists and I made a bunch of copies of it. It's right next to my door in the hallway, and you can just take a copy, pretend that you're taking it for a friend. I can also email that to you at any time. So consider this your content warning, because I'm going to tell you a story about my own family's trauma. And I'm not telling it because I'm special. I really think I'm not. I think I'm really rather typical. I think everybody has these stories in their families. I have long been the person to bear witness to trauma and stories of depression, suicides that were not completed and ones that were, bouts of mental illness. And as part of our theme of generosity this month, I'm asking you to be generous. Generous in growing your kindness as well as your awareness of trauma and mental health. And if this is unusual to you, this is your opportunity to learn more, to ask more questions and be more open. Generosity and the spirit of love is called for in brain health because I'm frankly just so stinking sad that it has such a stigma. I think that so many more people could get help if it didn't. Some of you know that most ministers in their career accompany one or maybe two families through a suicide or grave tragedy. And for whatever reason, maybe because I serve congregations for short periods of time, I've had more than 7 in the last 3 years. I've accompanied many people as well through psych admitting where they have had their purse searched and their shoelaces taken away and sat for hours while they try to explain what's happening to them. And sometimes they just needed a listening ear, and sometimes they needed hospitalization, medication, and therapy. I have become what's now termed trauma-informed because of my work, as well as my identities as queer and a person of color, where people tend to carry more traumatic experiences in those communities. And my own circle of friends is filled with people who are trauma-informed. Mentions of therapists and ACE scores, a number calculating the adverse childhood experiences someone has had, as well as medications and, who's your spiritual director and what's your therapist saying these days is just kind of common in our circles. No one blinks. I have friends whose callings give them opportunities to become trauma-informed, and they realize people having trauma is just kind of common. Talking about adverse life experiences can normalize them, and that's what I hope to do today a little bit. Many of us love people who come with some form of mental illness or mental health challenge. Brains, like any part of our nervous system, go through periods of ill health and wellness. It's bananas to me, and I use that on purpose, that some big organ in our body would somehow not have periods of ill health the way any other part of our body would. How could it be that that one would not have periods of stress or difficulty? Do you realize how ridiculous that is? That people all pretend, or that people hold up this armor as though they have never needed help with that. Silly. Some try to hide it. Others sadly go undiagnosed. Some try treating dozens of other things first. Some turn instead to alcohol or drugs or addiction or lose sleep or exercise more or do other things more or overfunction in other ways or destroy relationships or lose jobs or develop stress-related symptoms, trying to cope with mental illness or trauma. We're complicated people because we're people. And we're imperfect because we're people. And we love each other because we're people. We know now that the trauma we carry is not only what happened to us in this life, but if you read Vandercook, you learn all about all these studies that we also carry it in the genes from past generations. And every time I say that, I think of the Indigo songs about carrying stuff from another in another lifetime, right? That Indigo Girl song. And people often tell me what they were ashamed to tell others. This has been happening to me since I was a small kid. And I've come to notice that what many think is unspeakable is more often than not, sadly, common. The hardest thing people think they have to say, I've heard over and over and over. I have dreamed that people could address mental health head-on, move through the shame and get into greater health. Our society is constantly shaming anything to do with mental illness, therapy, psychiatric care, or traumatic events. How could we, as a congregation, release the stigma and increase our tenacity and even generosity in taking care of mental illness? Wouldn't it be cool if we were like, hey, been to therapy? You know? What I find fascinating about the reading today is that author Bessel van der Kolk shows through brain scans, you can watch them on YouTube, and genetic testing how trauma and mental illness reshape the brain. They actually change the nerve patterns. They change the pathways like highways, right? And we find generationally, trauma stays in our cells and travels our ancestral path. So if you need to, you can just blame your parents and your grandparents, right? You wanted to do it anyway, now you have science. Yes, I found a way to make you laugh in the mental health sermon, yes. Now, I grew up with a schizophrenic grandma. In fact, as the oldest granddaughter, I am one of the few in the family, and my mom has 7 siblings. I am one of the few who remembers her before her mind was so greatly deteriorated that she could still carry on conversations. And as a kid, people would even stop speaking about her when her name came up, and they made cruel, cruel jokes about her. And there was often a guilt from her loved ones and others who's experienced so much frustration that they cast blame on her, like it was her fault for having this, as though she would choose this, right? Who would choose this? Like many suffering from mental illness, my grandma sometimes tried controlling it with alcohol. And as a small child, I can remember knowing she could not have alcohol because it mixed terribly with the drugs that she had, which were not very elegant drugs. And there was no alcohol kept in the house, but sometimes she wanted to go to the store to buy beer when no other adults were home. And once I was staying with her at night, well, more than once I'd be staying with her at night, this happened frequently, and she knew she could not leave me home alone, and she really understood that. And so she would offer to get me candy bars at the corner store if I would walk with her and go there. And I really wanted those candy bars or ice cream she promised. But I knew if we went to the store, she would buy a 6-pack of beer, and I would say no, and she would ask repeatedly. And I'm talking about being 5 or 6 years old. And I felt so guilty, and I felt scared, and I kept saying no, but I felt bad for the whole situation. And it was a lot for a 5 or 6 or 7 or 8-year-old to take on. Now, as an adult, because I'm a geeky researcher, I spent years researching her story. What led to her greater and greater disconnect with the world? And how did it continue to get worse and worse? Now, I later learned that mental illness ran through that part of the family. And my grandmother carried a genetic disposition toward depression and anxiety. I later learned that in 1966, my great-aunt Agnes, the sister that my grandma Frances was closer to, had taken her own life. To make it even worse, my aunt and my grandma were what we used to call exotic-looking women. It was hidden from many that they were always covering up that they were Roma people, that we are Roma people, pejoratively called gypsies, and like many cultures just trying to pass in America, their ways and their sense of difference betrayed them. When the police arrived, they saw two women who were not American or white, and they arrested my grandmother on the assumption that my great-aunt's death had been a murder. My grandfather was thousands of miles away because my grandmother was out visiting, and he had to fly out there to get my grandmother out of jail. But upon returning to Detroit, she was put in Eloise Asylum. This was a place that held as many as 10,000 patients whom were abandoned and subject to abuse and repeated electroshock therapy and even secretly given lobotomies. The children were divided. The children, my mother and her siblings, were divided up and rotated around various friends and relatives. My grandmother was gone that time for almost a year. Thus started a series of long hospital stays that continued throughout her life. I share this to illustrate why so many are afraid to care for their trauma or mental health. Stories like this are real, and thank goodness that's not how mental health is addressed anymore. But it's not that far away. Likewise, it illustrates what can happen when you belong to a marginalized population and you are not given culturally competent care. I also have dozens of stories of getting incompetent mental health care, often because of my history or my identities being dismissed. Like when I tried to get some learning testing for my son, and my then wife and I were told that anything wrong with him was caused by my son having two moms. And later, when I accused the doctor of homophobia, she explained that she couldn't be because she has another gay client. Culturally appropriate care makes a huge difference in not adding more trauma during the times of high anxiety. It means only using providers that are well vetted. I am told on dating sites, you swipe right if you like someone and no if you swipe left if the profile does not appeal. Imagine if you could do that in life. What if we could brag about how good we are at mental health care to all of our friends and family? I'm imagining an app much like a dating site with notations like, I have done years of therapy. Oh, that sounds good, swipe right. I see my psychiatrist as directed and take my medication, swipe right. Someone writes, I think therapy is for wimps. Oh no, swipe left. I feel fine, so I went off my meds. Yikes, swipe left. I survived trauma in my childhood and I work at health every day. Hooray, swipe right. Maybe that's the wrong analogy because all the people mentioned deserve care, and it's hard to recognize what help you need and be able to have access to the care and pay for therapy and even medications and continue to work on it even when it is so very hard. Maybe we need a video game that rewards our mental health care. I know there are some out there. Or perhaps family reunions should start where we are witness to one another for things we feel we each deserve credit for addressing. You go to the family reunion and you get like points, right? Like, what have you done since the last reunion? See, I see people laughing, right? Wouldn't it be great? Like, instead of like bragging about how great your kid is, like you would be like, I've taken really good care of my mental health, and you would like go into this grouping, right? Instead of like, I got another degree, right? Wouldn't that be fun? I'd rather sit with those people. I screwed up and then I corrected it and I got better. Yay, I'm gonna go sit with them. I think that's the best part of going to therapy. You get that affirmation for what you survived. One of the best parts of being a minister is that we're like required to be in therapy almost all the time. And so if you go to a minister's event, like we're constantly talking about, oh, this is what happened in my spiritual direction. Oh, my therapist does this. Oh, I'm in art therapy now. And it's like totally normalized. I think almost all of us have some stories about mental illness or generational trauma or anxiety or depression, or some ways we've been shamed for it. And at some point, having a witness to help sort that out is going to benefit us. And for some, we've had something happen that may cause us to need therapy or medication or further evaluation. And wouldn't it be awesome if we just normalized that? There should be cheers we do at coffee hour. They went to therapy. Woo! Woo! They got their meds adjusted. Woo! Woo! I want a sticker to give out that says, I took my meds. I got some help. We'll wear them to church. I continued to study my grandmother and the impact her trauma had on the subsequent generations. I now know that my great-grandmother came to America fleeing generations of sexual assault, terror, and was even enslaved. I now know that when she got to America, she worked in a woolen mill making hats, felting. And that was way before OSHA or any of those great standards. And she was exposed to toxic chemicals, and that's where the term Mad Hatter came from. These women tried to better themselves, and they were also trying to escape lifetimes of terror. And sadly, that was passed down to my grandmother, and it shows up in my genes, right? These and stories like them are seldom told. Instead, our culture prioritizes stories of perfection, going it alone, not seeking help, stiff upper lip, and figuring it out yourself. How sad. Is that the kind of attitude that kept her family and even her children from knowing what happened to her? From people whispering or not even saying her name? Culturally incompetent care led her to being a human experiment for unauthorized treatments. What if she'd been surrounded by loving care? What if a trauma team had been dispatched to the scene where my great aunt was shot? What if her children had been able to visit her as she healed, and everyone was able to speak about the event in caring ways? My grandmother and great aunt and great grandmas all deserved loving therapists and skilled psychiatrists. They deserved massages and sweet soups and beautiful caring. Much has improved and continues to improve, but it ain't good enough yet. I call on you to bust the patriarchy. Be supportive to one another so the people will feel supported, being vulnerable about their struggles. Make asking for help easy. Because when people are feeling hurt, more shame doesn't help them get better faster or have it be any more difficult than it already is to recognize depression, anxiety, and trauma and get help. I want to encourage you to be proud of our successes when we overcome our inner challenges. Maybe we need to give one another a series of badges or trophies. Write them down on Post-its if that's all we can do, for all we've done to heal our brains and tune up on a regular basis. Brains need tune-ups just like your car. Just like your car. We take better care of our cars than we do our brains. And yet we expect them to work our whole lives. Don't forget your body is keeping the score on your mental health and tracking all the trauma you faced. It knows even when you want to hide. There is also some levity in considering how the trauma in our ancestors' lives might be compounding depression, anxiety, mental health, and physical health. Suddenly I can blame it on generations I never even met. Oh, are you going to therapy? Yeah, my relatives survived pillaging and slavery. I'm just repairing the gene pool. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, I learned trauma stays in my body even if I think I'm over it. Vandercook reminds us that we can do a lot to create relationships with our bodies and address trauma in ways besides therapy and psychiatry. Yoga and dance and singing and martial arts, or even belly dance. Activities that engage your body in a very mindful and purposeful way. That resets critical brain areas that get very disturbed by trauma. Singing. Trauma, Vandercook says, really does confront you with the best and the worst. You see horrendous things that people do to each other, but you also see resiliency and the power of love, the power of caring, the power of commitment, the power of commitment to oneself, the knowledge out there that things are larger than our individual survival. And in some ways, he says, I don't think you can appreciate the glory of life unless you know the dark side of life. And Rev D says, mental illness is something that most everyone is touched by. We can work to heal and make the environment for it better. It is the most generous thing you can do this month. Your mind is attached to the entire system of health. It's no different than your heart and your lungs, and they all need specialists and doctors. Your body is a system, and your mind is a big part of that. Please nourish it. I love you.